we've not been able to travel to different places this last couple of years. It's nice to hear about people's traveling stories and things as well, and it kind of makes us dream a bit more, and hopefully what we can do again in the future. It's always been a dream of mine to go to the Arctic and the Antarctic as well, and I'm determined to get there one day and take some pictures. So I always love hearing about people's experiences in these places, and just to hear about what it's like to be in there and experience the cultures and things like that. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk. And I'm on a different computer tonight, so I'm hoping that I'll stay connected. But if I don't, everything else should keep running anyway. So I'll hand you over to Sarah, and I'll be quiet. And I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much, James. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Really great to be with you. I wish I were in Orkney, very much. And I wish I could usher at the end of this talk John Ray onto the stage to give his comments on events. I've always admired him, knowing a little bit about Arctic history. Of course, mostly, as you all know, discovering the last navigable link of that crucial passage, but more really from my own point of view of how he learned so much from the Inuit, the indigenous peoples, which notably so many British explorers didn't. And I have admired him massively for that. So I'm going to take you on a circumpolar Arctic journey tonight, I hope. Now, it was quite a long time ago when I myself did this journey and wrote my book, The Magnetic North, about it. So much so that I was just trying to reacquaint myself over the past days with it. I live in London on Hampstead Heath, but I teach 2 days a week. I've got a fellowship in Oxford College. That's where I am now. So coming down this morning on the train, I brought my book, The Magnetic North, and I thought I better have a look at it to remind myself of some of the things. So I opened it up and was reading, I was opening it up and was reading it, and it kind of took me back. And then I suddenly looked up, and coming down the corridor of the train towards me was an old boyfriend of mine I haven't seen for a really long time. And everything goes very, it's that sort of both going faster in slow motion, because I realized he was looking at me reading my own book. And, you can't get much more rubbish than that. So anyway, I wanted to get that off my chest. So I've got some photographs to show you of the journey. But before I do that, I'm going to start off with a bit of an introduction to the Arctic, which I had myself, because I started off really my interest in the polar regions in the Antarctic. So I'm going to read you a little bit from the beginning of the Magnetic North, which will, I hope, explain a little bit about the difference between the two places. And you can think to yourselves how much you know about that before I get to the end. So 15 years earlier, that's before I wrote this journey, that was in the Magnetic North, I had spent some time in Antarctica. Its geographical unity and unownedness attracted the younger me, as did the lack of an indigenous human presence and inability to sustain terrestrial life. It was a metaphor for a terra incognita, an image of an alternate and better world. I was prejudiced against the complicated life-infested North. Time passed, and I travelled briefly with the Sami and their reindeer. We'll see more about that later. I started thinking about the collar of lands around the Arctic Ocean, fragmentation, disputed ownership, indigenous populations immobilized on the threshold of change. Those very things Antarctica lacked appealed to the older me, especially fragmentation. When I thought about the Arctic, in my mind's eye, I glimpsed an elegy for the uncertainties and doubts that are the chaperones of age. Was the Arctic a counterweight to the Antarctic? The Greeks called it Arctos, the Great Bear, or Northern Pole Star, and the Antarctic was the anti-Arctos, or the opposite. Or was it just a frozen mirror image, an I who had changed? The Arctic is our neighbour, part European, part North American, us. What could be less romantic? And the world seems a wearier place than it did a decade and a half ago. It is the Arctic that captures the spirit of the times. The Arctic is the lead player in the drama of climate change, and polar bears are its poster boys. So I went. On a speck of land in the northern reaches of the Arctic Ocean, the encircling water chaotic with flows, I heard a snow bunting sing. Not a single songbird breeds on the Antarctic continent. The sweet trill of a small black and white bird brought the Arctic to life. So now I am going to start. So here is the first slide. That is not an Arctic parking meter. But it's a very sacred site. If the Arctic had sacred sites like those temples and Mayan people and so on that tourists flock to see, this would be it. It's a borehole. It's the metal pole is in a borehole, and out of the borehole was pulled in 1993 2 miles of ice. So it's a tube of ice that's 2 miles long, chopped up into bits. So it's like 2 miles of telegraph poles. And the ice cores, that's what they're called, that come out, they were the ones. Scientists have been coring ice for a long time, but it was in 1993, in September, that they were able to, so far as anybody has been able to bring us definitive data about the big melt. That was the first one. And the Times led with the headline, Big Melt Shock. So really, climate change seems old news now to you and me, and we're used to reading it every day. But it was then in 1993 that it moved from the margins to the mainstream as a result of 2 miles of ice that got pulled out of that hole. Now, more of that later. I've said already that what's the difference between the Antarctic and the Arctic? Well, one's a continent surrounded by water, and one is water surrounded by lots of continents. But the main difference is life, people, life, the snow bunting, but more than anything else, it is people. The Arctic has people. The Antarctic is biological. Haiku. There's nothing. There's not even any wildlife in the middle of it. Any marine life on the outside. So that's a very potent thing for a writer. That difference between life and non-life, particularly to an older writer. As I tried to say, I was a young woman when I wrote my book about the Antarctic hopes, and all of that. The Arctic is more about reality, the kind of thing you think about when you're in between 50 and 60, that sort of elegiac end times stuff. So there's a man in the landscape, and that really does change everything. So I'll tell you now about some aspects of my circumpolar journey. It wasn't one journey, actually, it was lots of little journeys. It was anti-clockwise. It's sort of up and down, up and down, up and down, going to as many circumpolar lands. Now, I'm not a natural, I'm a born traveller, but I'm not a natural coper in extreme environments. I'm certainly not a sledge puller. I don't have any of those skills. I always say to people introducing me when I'm giving talks, where they say, how do you want to be introduced? I say, well, I don't really care as long as you don't say I'm an explorer. First of all, I'm not, and I don't have any of the skills. And secondly, I don't want to be one particularly. And I'm just a writer. And this is what a writer does in extreme environments, is sits around finding places to write. And that is on the top of the Greenland ice sheet. There's a certain amount of practicalities, of course, that you have to not sort of looked after and so on. And many aspects of my stay in all the extreme environments where I end up are sort of, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember the Carry On films, but sort of Carry On at the Arctic would often come to mind when I was trying to get my tent up, or that skidoo you can see in the background working, or whatever. But I didn't have a tent like that one, by the way. That's a scientist's communal tent. They were coring ice. They were coring ice. It was an ice coring camp there at that particular spot on top of the Greenland ice sheet. So this was generation after the one I showed you about. Yeah, so I'm going to mix up all the different places I went to here. People who write about travel a lot, they like place names. And that's my favorite Antarctic, my favorite polar place name. And that was in Alaska, of course. Americans love their place names. Yeah. Okay, Ron and Sue, you need to mute yourselves because we can hear you. Yeah, so this in Alaska, the Dalton Highway, don't know if any of you have heard of that. The US, of course, is an Arctic stakeholder. They've got that northern coast up there. And from Fairbanks, Alaska, up to that northern coast is the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, which carries the oil down from Prudhoe Bay. Now, we're going to talk a lot about oil and hydrocarbons and all the rest of it, but that is called the Haul Road, Fairbanks to Deadhorse, and they've got the Yukon on one side, and it goes right up to the, as I say, to the Arctic Circle, to the Prudhoe Bay, the oil fields, and the oil comes down the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. We'll see more of that later. Hold on a second. Yeah, okay, that's it. So the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, that is the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. It goes in a wonky like that because that stops it freezing and makes the transport of the oil more, anyway, if you know anything about physics, you can tell me why it's that, but that's why it's not in a straight line. But here's the thing, here's the point. This is a poster produced by the American government when the pipeline was being built in the 70s to persuade the indigenous people of Alaska that the pipeline was a great thing. Part of our past, here for the future. One of those statements is true. And we'll talk a lot about buying off the indigenous peoples all around the circumpolar Arctic. That's the Arctic story, really. That's how it went on in Alaska, still goes on now. How PR, getting people, remember Exxon Valdez and all the rest of it. It's an ugly story. Okay, so people often would say to me, what could possibly be interesting about all that ice? That wasn't what they said, but I knew it's what they meant. And there's three things really I could say after I'd been around the Arctic, spent a lot of time there, spent a couple of years in the library and the archives, deciding what I wanted to write, what were the interesting things, what were the themes of the Magnetic North. One, cultural and social destruction that I've just talked a little bit about there. Indigenous peoples all around the circumpolar Arctic being dragged into the cash economy. Lots of things about that. It's a very Arctic story. Secondly, exploration. Epic stories of shoe eating, John Ray, you know it. It's just, I can't get enough of those stories. And there are many of them, like Shackleton, you know, that he's on my mind because, of course, because it's the centenary of his death. So there's tons of stuff going on about him. And, you know, they're just great stories. And thirdly, the reality of climate change, which I've talked a little bit about already, and polar bears, poster boys for climate change still as now, really. So let's deal with social and cultural destruction. I mean, it's a Wednesday evening. I don't want this to be a sort of massive downer. And I, you know, really want to celebrate these people like this fellow here, who are still there herding their reindeer and being marine mammal hunters, some of them. And I want to focus that aspect, that thread about the indigenous peoples on Russia. Why? One, Russia has more Arctic territory than any other nation. It's got 5,000 miles. And up there, there are 37 different indigenous Russian polar peoples. So we're not talking about the Inuit or the Inupiaq or any of that lot. Russian peoples. 37 distinct ones, mostly mutually unintelligible languages. Each one of those 37's got loads of subgroups and sister groups and all the rest of it. So loads and loads of people with incredibly rich cultures going back millennia before the Cossacks galloped east of the Urals. Russia has the coldest part of the Arctic landmass, the coldest temperature ever recorded in the Sakha Republic, minus 72.11 degrees Celsius, which is minus 97 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's without wind chill. Super cold. You think it's cold in Orkney. It really isn't. And when you're there, you realize that everything sort of has evolved in response to cold, and that cold is the natural state of things. And heat seems like not the natural state of things, like a luxury, really. And of course, I had had a lot of that. I spent 7 months in the Antarctic, as I said, and I had a lot of experience of extreme cold. I remember doing that thing of throwing a mug of tea in the air, the liquid part, and it freezes before it shatters on the ice, and the coldest I had was minus 115 with wind chill. It's pretty cold. But you see people living and animals living in this massive ecosystems, everything going on. It's kind of something else in the Arctic. So this is a Nenets reindeer herder you can see here. And that's about halfway across from the Urals to the Russian Far East. As you know, east of the Urals is mostly Siberia. And then once you come out of Siberia, you come to the Russian Far East, and notably Chukotka, which we're coming to. And here is a lovely little man in Chukotka in the, now when was that, do you think? I want to say the 18th century. So wood carving, reindeer herders in Chukotka, although most of the people there on the coast were marine mammal hunters. Now, Chukotka in the Russian Far East. Now, it's really not known at all, and it's closed to foreigners, which quite a few places in Russia are. What happened was when the USSR collapsed, all the portcullises came out. And then they slammed down again in many places pretty quickly for one reason only, really, is that the Russian government doesn't want Westerners to see how polluted everything is. Anyway, it's always possible to get anywhere. And I did get to Chukotka, and I'll say more about that later. But you'll remember Sarah Palin in her doomed campaign to become elected. No, with her successful campaign, I suppose, to become vice president. She said, well, I know Russia, I look out of my window, do you remember? And look at it from Alaska. So that's what she's looking at, is Chukotka, because that's like the Bering Strait separates Russia and America there by just a tiny amount. That's what Sarah Palin looked at. It's 250,000 square miles, Chukotka, 250,000 square miles. And there are no roads and nothing grows. Nothing grows. This is obviously below the tree line, this. This is the only supermarket in a region the size of France in Chukotka, and it was new, so it's a big thing, and they hadn't got the hang of it. This is the capital of Chukotka, Anadyr. They hadn't got the hang of the supermarket, and they would go in 6 times a day, buy an item each time and come out again. Now, the grim thing is, I've said nothing grows in Chukotka, so everything in the supermarket's come an awfully long way. That doesn't do anybody any good. I think I reached the nadir when I found some Arctic roll in there that had been made in a factory west of the Urals, south of Moscow. But my point is this. This is Chukotka, and that was in my grandmother's lifetime, my mother's lifetime probably, and that's the guy bringing his tea home for the family. It's a walrus head. So from that to that in one generation, that's a long way to travel and too fast, and it doesn't have very good, there's a lot of big issues. And when I was in Anadyr, there was I saw on a telegraph pole a notice advertising a flat in return for a single air ticket into Moscow. There's no work. There's a lot of big issues. I had a lot of fun when I was there. bizarre beyond belief. I remember seeing a lot of little boys running around with Chelsea caps on, Chelsea Football Club. I thought, this is very bizarre. And I found out that Roman Abramovich had decided to headquarter all his companies in Anadyr, because of course there's an incredibly low tax base. And he thought he might as well become governor while he was at it, to make sure he kept it. So he was the governor, and everybody was a Chelsea fan. In the villages all around Anadyr were all these disenfranchised marine mammal hunters, and everybody was drunk or stoned, and it was grim. And in terms of acculturation, what I realised was that every Arctic country, it tries in its different ways to bring its Arctic peoples into the fold of the world we live in, where you've got to have a national security number and use money and all the rest of it. Some with good intentions. Nobody's had better intentions than Canada. And Health Canada, over the generations, since the 40s really, have just done so much with good intentions for their Arctic peoples. Alaska, I've read about the pipeline, and they've done so much about mining companies have to share the profits with the indigenous peoples on whose land they're getting out hard metals or hydrocarbons of various kinds. And then there's bad effects of people getting a ton of money one day, so you have to give the money in different times, and that gets hijacked by people coming up, and then you ban the sale of alcohol. They've been through it. Everybody's been through it. The Danes did it with prefabricated housing for their indigenous peoples in Greenland. The Swedes have done it with chainsaws, chopping down the forest and all the rest of it. The point is that everybody has done different things by their Arctic peoples with various intentions. Russians couldn't care less. But the result has been the same everywhere, which is disenfranchisement, bad acculturation, and addiction and bad things. And we haven't even got onto pollution yet. So that was dispiriting. But however, there's circumpolar people's associations. I'll talk a bit about them, I hope, later. And so on, which are now, and then we know for more zeitgeisty times now, self-empowerment for small nations and all the rest of it. Anyway, I saw an awful lot of that, and I tried to write about it, and I tried to give these people a voice who hadn't had one before. This is Haircut of the Year. How would you go about replicating that fantastic piece of chignon work there? This is Anadyr, okay, that I was telling you about. So again, you think, gosh, that really un-Arctic, that, because it looks quite nice and well looked after, and these fantastic murals commissioned. Well, that was all Roman Abramovich's money. I said there were no roads. There's no roads outside Anadyr. You see, they do have a road in Anadyr, and you see there's no cars on it. That is not the Bering Strait you see in the back. It's the Bering Strait's on the other side of that land. So Sarah Palin is on the other side of that land there, but it's very near the Bering Strait. Perhaps a more welcome sight of lots and lots of reindeer. But I want to say one other crucial thing about acculturation and so on, and bringing Arctic peoples into the fold. Another thing that we've invented and told everybody they've got to have to be like us is a language we can understand. And so that had to be done as well. There had to be some way of communicating with Arctic peoples. And so in Soviet times, they sent the delegations up from the Language Institute in Petersburg, Leningrad, and get them all sorted out in their tents and have the town hall tent, and we'll sit down with an interpreter and we start codifying these language, this Russian and whatever it is you speak. We'll start codifying it, and the Soviets were great record keepers, and so we have all of this in the archives of the language institutes. And so it would go like this. They'd say, okay, let's do numbers first. 1, and they'd have a stone there to say 1. What's 1 in your language? They'd write that down. So you've got 1, 2, do that. 3, do that. 4. What are you talking about? 4. It goes 1, 2, 3, many. that really struck me as conceptually what we're dealing with. People don't have numbers because they don't need them, but they have to have numbers if they're going to participate in the world we've decided is the one we have to all live in. I'm not going to say much about the religion piece. And missionaries, in fact, in the Arctic have not done nearly as badly as they did elsewhere in the world. There's some great stories written by early Danish missionaries in Greenland, bringing the word to the Inuktitut there. And they had to, first of all, of course, translate the word of God into the Inuktitut language. And there's some really tremendous stories because, of course, you have to translate concepts as well. So we have the Lord's Prayer, and I promise you, it says, "Bring us this day our daily seal." I'm not making fun of anybody. Right. Oh yeah, I just wanted to say that was actually I didn't tell you where that was. That's the Barrens, which is this enormous part of Canada, and I saw there in the Barrens what I saw in a lot of places in the Arctic, in a good way, how the two things can live together: contemporary culture, what we've said is how it is now, and what they've brought with them traditionally, the indigenous peoples. For example, I went out caribou hunting with a couple of young men on Southampton Island, which is one of those ones at the top of Hudson's Bay in Canada, not that far from the Barrens in Canadian terms. And we had a lovely day. They're allowed to hunt caribou, they have their quota. And had a lovely day. And they spent quite a lot of it talking about playing poker stars on the internet, like all young men of their age. But they, were very happily deploying the hunting skills that they'd learned from that had been passed down generations, and they knew how to quarter the caribou after. And it seemed to me there was something gratifying and satisfying about that. And in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, I remember seeing seal ribs pegged on a washing line next to some very frilly nylon knickers. And it seemed to me that was a very satisfactory suggestion that there was a way. It's a writer's duty to have hope. I'll say more about that later. So the second theme I told you about exploration, which you know a lot about already with your devotion to John Ray. I'm going to talk a little bit about that now, exploration. And so another little reading from the Magnetic North. Introducing you to exploration in its Arctic manifestation. Although the beauties and intractable problems of the contemporary Arctic framed my journeys, I could not ignore generations of explorers. Like the scientists who succeeded them, they went north to unlock secrets. Their adventures frequently descended into a tragic farce of shoe eating when they ran out of food and poetic death. But still, heroic individual struggle is a theme of this book. Who can resist the David squaring up to a Goliath army of towering bergs? In America, Arctic mania persisted from the Civil War to the First World War, even at a time when Americans were going west. The North Pole and its wailing waters cast a spell, luring pole seekers in little wooden ships, in balloons, zeppelins, planes, icebreakers, and submarines. In 1909, 2 Americans on separate expeditions claimed to have stood at the North Pole. I expect you know about this. And over in the old world, even Pope Pius XI was not immune to worldly longing. As a young priest, Achille Ratti, as he was then, applied to join one of the Duke of Abruzzes' expeditions. Ratti was a keen alpinista, but the Duke judged that a priest would be bad for morale. So well, I'll just tell you about this. This is not a comprehensive history at all. I just picked out things basically because I liked them. Or if it was, sometimes the stories were so legendary, it'd be perverse to ignore them, like Ray's pursuit of Sir John Franklin, for example, the shoe consumer of all time, John Franklin. But here's one of the ones I like too much to leave them out. But there was a lot of candidates, a superfluity of candidates, and I had to ditch some favourites. And for example, here's one. I didn't really ditch him. I gemmed him in here. Valerian Albanov. He was a gifted navigator whose ship froze into the Kara, most dreaded of Arctic seas. Fed by 4 of the great Siberian rivers, Kara is frozen for 9 months of the year, an annihilating wilderness spread over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. In 1912, Albanov set off from the Murmansk coast on a projected 7,000-mile voyage to Vladivostok in search of fresh marine hunting grounds. When the Kara ice closed in, 25 men and 1 woman drifted 2,400 miles in 18 months, during which time they ran out of fuel and had to chop up the wooden walls of the cabins to keep the samovar going. In April 1914, Albanov and 13 others set off by sledge for an uninhabited archipelago using a hopeless map and a faulty chronometer. 3 men quickly returned to the vessel, but the rest marched on for 92 days. They were weak and dreaming of peaches, but Albanov got them there, carrying an icon of St. Nicholas under his parka. He couldn't keep them alive, though. I stood on the headland where 9 lie in unmarked graves. A passing Russian boat rescued the other 2, Albanov one of them. That's how we know all of this. Think how many stories we don't know. Those stranded on the ship, the ones who hadn't gone, were never seen again. So, exploration. I expect some of you who know who that is. Exploration casts a lot of light on contact, my idea of contact, between Indigenous peoples. This is the polar hero of all time. It is Nansen. I expect you know that. He was a big superstar in the North, in the Arctic, for his pioneering feats in Greenland and the Arctic Ocean. And
sorry, I'm just saying we've still got the caribou on the screen.
Can you not see that now, Nansen?
That's better now. I can see it.
Thank you.
And I wonder how that happened, because I was looking at Nansen then. Honestly, it's got a mind of its own, hasn't it, technology? It's absolutely terrifying. Well, that's a good lesson to us then. Speak up again, because I was looking at Nansen then. Anyway, yeah, and also he was a neurologist. So gifted as a neurologist that there are these nerves that if you talk to your own neurologist and ask him about Nansen fibers, he'll know what they are. Still named after him. And he won a Nobel Prize he was the first secretary for his role in the League of Nations, Nansen passports, refugees. He was just a massive superstar, Nansen. And I wanted to speak about him, partly because it introduces my favourite moment of exploration history, eclipsing even John Ray, our big star, which took place when Nansen got frozen in his ship in the Arctic Ocean. And in 1895, at 86 degrees north, it was about 230 miles short of the North Pole, which nobody had been to. They didn't even know whether it was land or not. Frozen in. And the only thing to do was for him and one of his colleagues, he handpicked the best man for the job, Johansson, to walk to try and get them to rescue. Well, they didn't know where they were. So where was rescue? It was an absolutely epic trip, 146 days, 600 miles with no change of underwear. Winter set in. They had to spend this winter in a sleeping bag together. It was a big sleeping bag, but still. Eating walrus and seal that they'd stored up to wait until the sun rose again. all that happened. The sun did rise again. Nansen kept a diary, and after all of that, when the sun rose and they got out of the sleeping bag for good, he said that he wrote in his diary that he'd said to Johansen, why don't we start addressing one another by our Christian names? Which seems to me just a sort of extraordinary feat of human endurance and of reconciliation, or of something or other, that they'd been through all of that. Anyway, Pat, the reason I'm telling you this story is what happened. And they have no idea where they are, okay? All these other ones are still on the ship, God knows where, miles away. No idea where they are. They had brought collapsible kayaks with them, so they kayaked 100 miles. Then a walrus destroyed the kayak, and the food was running out. It was kind of the end of the road, pretty much. And then they heard a dog barking. And Johansen stayed. Nansen skied around the corner. And, oh, no, hold on a minute. Oh, that happened. It was Frederick Jackson, there's Nansen on the right, it was Frederick Jackson on the Harmansworth expedition, happened to be there, Franz Joseph Land, uninhabited then now, archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. And it was just all by complete chance, and they met one another. It looks like they were in Pall Mall, doesn't it? Illustrated London News. It seems to me that is, and the meeting was recorded by both of them. Now, bear in mind that Nansen was the most famous explorer in the world, and Jackson didn't know he was. And Jackson looked at his face like this, apparently. Imagine what Nansen looked like. And he says, aren't you Nansen? And Nansen says, yeah, I am. And Jackson says, by Jove, I'm damn glad to see you. And they brought them home. They went to rescue the other lot, and it was all fabulous. Nobody died. So, now, shoe eating is well known, but now I just want to tell you about something else, another aspect of the expeditions, which doesn't really get much publicity. They all had girlfriends, and this was Peary's girlfriend. Peary was one of those in 1909. Do you remember I told you, said they'd got to the North Pole? Peary claimed, Admiral Peary said he was the first one to get there. Nobody believes him now except the members of the Peary Society. I made it all up, but this was his girlfriend. He was a very gifted photographer, Peary, and this is his girlfriend. And of course, their voices are never heard. The explorers left lots of children behind, and it's a story that's never told. And you know, I like to think that I remember them a little bit in my own way. They were, you know, they were the first 20th century celebrities, really, the explorers, and they were monomaniacal. Not all of them, but a lot of them, even by the testosterone-fueled standards of the shoe-eating fraternity. Now, you might have wondered at the beginning, I said I didn't want to be an explorer. Some sort of idea why. Now, here's another lot with their girlfriends. They were Brits. And right in the middle was Augustin Courtauld. It was his expedition in the 20s, very heroic period, the 20s. In the far north, it's a sort of Spitsbergen area all around there. I think, no, what can't have been Spitsbergen? Where was it? Greenland, that's right. And so there they all are with their Inuit girlfriends. You see how some of the girls look very pleased with themselves. I like that one there in the middle, looking straight out. That was Gino Watkins, I think. I said it was Augustin Courtauld's expedition. Actually, Watkins was the leader. No, that was Watkins on the left, and that's, I think, Courtauld with that woman looking extremely pleased with herself. Anyway, all the children got left behind. Of course, there was no question about any acknowledgement or any kind of support. And so there we are. That is how human knowledge inches its way forward. And all of these people had, you know, services for them in Westminster Abbey when they got back. Gino Watkins, who was the leader of this one, he got killed by a berg, a calving berg, and he had exactly that, a big service in Westminster Abbey and the King goes and all the rest of it. This part of the story is never mentioned. That wasn't the narrative. Incidentally, all this talk about the North Pole, it's funny how we can all come up with Amundsen's name, the first of the South Pole, and we can certainly all come up with Hillary and Tenzing. But we can't come up with who was the first at the North Pole, can we? Maybe some of you can. In fact, I can't, because almost certainly it was in 1948 and it was 24 Soviets who got there. So I think that's kind of quirky, strange thing that we don't know that. That, by the way, is in 1928. That picture was taken a year before Watkins died. So before we go on to the third strand, talking of children, I can't resist this. This is my eldest son. And that in the background, as I took him, I went on a Russian icebreaker on assignment across the Arctic Ocean. How a lot of these, like most writers, magazine and newspaper assignments, and then they get stitched together to form the book. And I was on an assignment on that Russian icebreaker for Vanity Fair, and he came with me. And as I say, it was Russian, and the Russian crew adopted him. When it came time for him to choose his foreign languages at secondary school, I said, well, let me tell you right now, you're not doing Russian, because I knew perfectly well the vocabulary he had picked up on that ship, which is Kapitan Pevnikov there, you can see in the background. We are now going on to we're moving to the Sami people, known as Lapps. And I went on assignment for Telegraph, actually, they're not nomadic anymore, the Sami, the reindeer herding Sami. They're not nomadic, but what they do is they bring the reindeer up and down twice a year and look after them communally. And this was a time when they were bringing the reindeer down from the mountains to the pastures. And I'm going on to that part of the story now, but I'm partly showing it to you here because I'm not sure if you can see this arrow. That little baby, and that's my second son. And I just thought, well, I can take him and do what they do with their babies, which I sort of did, although they said I had to. So one of them came up one day with a roll of silver foil because I was feeding him myself. I said, oh, you put the foil down your shirt and it reflects the sun. I thought that's just a step too far. And likewise, when they tried to get me, they gave me some reindeer fat yellow cubes. So that's what I said, he's not weaned yet. And they said, well, that's what we wean them on. Thought, not likely. So this is just a little passage I'm reading you now about what it was like with the reindeer herding Lapps. Herds of reindeer move across ice and snow. Slim-shouldered Lapps squatting on skidoos nose their animals towards an arc of stockades. I was very near here. A man in a corral holds a pair of velvet antlers while another jabs a needle into damp haunch. They're vaccinating the beasts. I make my way towards the outer palisades where Lapps beyond working age stoke beechwood fires and gulp from bowls of reindeer broth, faces masked in musky steam. The first new snow has fallen and the Hara Sami are herding reindeer down to the winter grazing. A livid sun hangs on the horizon. Sami or Lapps were the last nomadic people in Europe, and until recently castrated reindeer at this place by biting off their balls. In the stockade, I take my baby son from his wooden sledge, proud like a miniature Viking ship, and wrap him closer in his calf pelts. The Lapps divided the corralled herd, each smaller group husbanded by an association of families, Sijda, in pastures close to home. Down at the end of summer, up at the end of winter, the cycle of life above the Arctic Circle. At 3:30, the sun vanished. It was the cuspy season between white night and darkness at noon, the period in which the Arctic turns inside out. The thunderous pounding stopped. Below the corral, people who had come to recover stray reindeer struggled to load them into stumpy horse boxes. In the distance, the lights of Hara shimmered through a dark haze. The silence of the winter forest settled over the corral, fractured only by the cry of a nightjar. When I came to unwrap Reggie, that's my son's name, Reginald, from his pelt, the soft green and orange beams of the northern lights swept the sky. Now, that's enough of all of that. There are no more children to go. Science and exploration, before we get on to a bit more about climate change, I'm always very interested to write about how artists respond to these environments, because that's what I am. I'm an artist responding. And there's never any shortage. This is an uplifting fact. But here is my top fave. Yeah, I forgot that one. That's the little herder there. That one got left out. That's there in northern Sweden. That's little Lap getting them all in. Okay, so you can see this is Salamina. This is a fellow called Rockwell Kent, and I'm very keen on him. It's a woodcut, and he did masses of woodcuts, and he went to the north of Greenland in the 1930s in flight, he said, from contemporary America, the chaos. He said, people said, why did you go? He said, in flight from the chaos of 1930s America. Well, you can imagine. He came from Chicago, I think. And he lived up there. And that was his girlfriend, and did all these incredibly beautiful woodcuts and paintings too, and wrote. He had to make special gloves with the holes cut for his thumb, you know, because it was to be outside. Yeah, he wrote things about expressing the contentment of merely being, which is what he found in the Greenlandic people he lived among. And I really admire that. I mean, isn't that the aim of all civilized people? The contentment of merely being, like Salamina, his housekeeper here. And he wrote, in Greenland, one discovers as if for the first time what beauty is. God must forgive me that I tried to paint it. Others had tried before. That is a 17th century Lap man praying to his god. The shrine was, of course, antlers. I put that in really because I couldn't bear to leave it out. Right, now we have to say a little bit more about climate change now. So here we are back to the parking meter. Sacred site, so much so, I'd heard so much about it. I've talked to a lot of scientists. When I got there, I felt I should make a sacrifice. And I was camped not far from there on the Greenland ice sheet. So I was on top of 10,500 feet of ice. And the tents they had there are called Arctic ovens, a huge misnomer, I might say. So it's sort of standard double wall pyramid. That might mean something to you, adapted for the polar regions, a sort of dark lining to absorb solar radiation. I'd forgotten about all of that until I started reading about it again this morning, and it sort of slightly brought me out, and it made me feel cold even thinking about it again. Because this theory about insulation and all the rest of it, an Arctic oven, that was all theory, all well and good. In fact, it didn't do any of that, and it was like sleeping in the polar regions. You've got to have a lot of stuff in the sleeping bag with you, any batteries you need for anything, and any camera equipment, and your water bottle, your drink locks is very high, salt water freezing, and some socks for tomorrow if you don't want them to be frozen. So you've got a lot of stuff, sort of spare scientific paraphernalia. So it's like sleeping in a cutlery drawer in a freezer. And it brought back all the horror of that this morning when I was reading about it again. And one would crawl out in the morning like a figure from some sort of key stage of evolution onto the ice shelf. Now imagine you're doing all of that and you've got to get these cores out, these parking meters of ice. Incredible. Down underneath there, chambers, really hard thing keeping a hole open in the ice. How do you keep it open? Well, you keep it open quite a lot with butyl acetate. Not a very nice thing to have around, smells horrid. And what they're doing is mapping climate history, but my goodness, that's one of the hardest jobs. Mapping climate history, because the telegraph pole at the bottom of all of that will be the temperature and the quality of the air 200,000 years ago, enabling climate history. I mean, to me, an absolute non-scientist. It's magic. Now, I began with an open mind, no political agenda. I'm not a scientist. But you can't spend time in the Arctic and come home with any doubts about the overall speed of glacial melt and the multitudinous consequences of that. There is still a lot of ice. That is that icebreaker I was telling you about, smashing its way through. It was a Kapitan Klepnikov, as they say, it's Russian, but there's a hell of a lot of it left. There's a hell of a lot of ice left than there used to be, both on the ocean, the Arctic Ocean you're looking at there, and in the glaciers on top of the Greenland ice sheet. And the extent and the thickness of sea ice is obviously not the only critical issue. I expect you've heard of oceanic circulation. The pumps, the hot water, the warm water goes up and the cold water comes down, and there's pumps that keep it going round at various key places, some of which not a million miles away from you. And I was on that icebreaker, and the captain is from Vladivostok, very saturnine figure. He pointed out to me various pump sites. He knew where they were in the Greenland Sea that shift, like a conveyor belt, shift this water around. You know, they're turning off, and that's going to be a big thing. You know about all the rest of it, all those great tides of carbon dioxide and methane, and the baby mammoths that are all going to come to the surface, and all the rest of it. Whichever way you look at it, a lot hangs on what happens in the Arctic. Then when I was there, when I was writing my book, and now and in the future. I didn't really want this to be doom laden. I've said that, and writers have to have hope, and I believe that. So you see how beautiful it is, but I suppose it seems near to you.
We can't see it.
Oh, see that one?
Yes, thank you.
Can you see that one? Can you see the second iceberg one?
Yep.
Yes.
As I say, they've got a bloody mind of their own, haven't they, these things? And more and more fun. These are the first polar bears I ever saw. You see them a lot going across the icebreaker. You know, the first ones are sort of massively exciting, and then they become quite everyday. Now, I have to say a little bit about the paradox of a lot of the pollutants that we are sending to the Arctic and have been doing for a generation or two. And the paradox is that the people who live furthest away from contaminants, i.e. the polar peoples, are often the ones who are the most affected by them. And there's some Greenlanders that qualified 20 years ago as hazardous waste. It's a very horrible story. Partly it's to do with the marine food chain. Some of you might be old enough to remember PCBs, flame retardants, all this kind of stuff that everybody banned in the 70s, really. It's a long time ago now. But of course, they've entered the food chain, they've entered the sea, they're there. And there's many complex factors in the way that they're passed up. Some of the deadliest pollutants, those things that are banned now, they go up through that process of bioaccumulation, you know, and biomagnification. And it's partly to do with they're not water soluble, but they're fat soluble. And polar creatures, of course, have more fat for obvious reasons. And so it goes up and up and up the food chain. At the top of the food chain are people who eat still now polar bears and whales and so on, according to their quotas. So it's toxins. They're not water soluble, but they're fat soluble. Just all ghastly, terrible, endocrine disrupting chemicals. Some of you might know about that. Changes in the sex of unborn children. There's studies done among polar peoples in Russia that, you know, twice as many girls as used to be because of that endocrine disrupting. Anyway, I'm looking at the clock now. Let us end in Russia, and the pictures, I mean, not the talk, in Russia where we began. Now, where did we begin? We began in the Russian Far East. Remember where that was? All the way over here. So this is over here. This is west of the Urals. This is in the White Sea. This is European. This is us.
Can't see it.
Well, I'm looking at it.
There we
Can
go.
you see? Yeah, isn't that? See, was looking at that before on my screen. Anyway, this is the last one, I think, so it's going to put us out of our misery. So this is the White Sea, the Solovki Monastery in the White Sea, European Russia. And for me, a paradigm really of the Arctic in many ways. First of all, this is one of the holiest places in the whole of Russia, of Orthodox Russia, the Solovki Monastery in the White Sea. And pilgrims throughout human history of the Orthodox Church in Russia. And then it became the site of the first Gulag, the first organized labor camp, I should say, before the Gulag system spread all over. And many thousands and thousands of people died there. And so, you know, I mean, that's a perfect symbol for a writer of the holy aspect of the Arctic and its deadliness. And it was really here in Solovki that everything came together for me about the Arctic. That's why I had it the last chapter of my book. Acculturation, oil, art, exploration, climate change. And I think you will have gathered by now from what I'm saying that the Magnetic North is not a book about polar bears. They're cute and I like to show pictures of them, but it's about people. This is a book about people. It's a story about people. The Arctic story is a story of people. And I think people are more interesting than bears, don't you? And it was here in the White Sea that I glimpsed something mysterious and indefinable that has outlived both cultural collapse I've spoken about and the Gulag and the Soviet system that produced it, not orthodoxly, however. And hope from the scientists I learned, and I really believe this, it's a bit of a James Lovelock thing, you know, expect, you know, Gaia and so on, but any cutting edge scientists will say the same thing. You say to them, what's going to happen? Earth will regulate itself, as it always has. Planet Earth will be okay. It's us who are at stake. Greedy, lovable people. It all came back to people in the end. And my very modest Arctic journey, I said I'm not an explorer, turned out to be a quest, really. And it was, to quote T.S. Eliot, to see beneath both beauty and ugliness, to see the boredom, and it was to me. I said at the beginning that the Antarctic is a whole continent which doesn't sustain life, and that's an image of the world as it might be. And the Arctic is an image of the world as it is. In all its degradation, I've shown you that today, and beauty, I hope I've shown you a bit of that as well. And that's why I think it's the Arctic that captures the spirit of the times. So that's the end of Solovki. I'm going to do read, before we have, I hope you'll ask me some questions if you have any, which James will field. I'm going to do one more reading from the Magnetic North about John Ray, who I'm very pleased to say, as soon as James asked me if I would come and speak to you all, I thought, oh God, I really hope I put him in my book. And I looked him in the index, not James, I mean John Ray, and very pleased that he is indeed there. So after this, we'll have questions. And I was talking to my publisher earlier today, and she said, what are you doing? And I said, I was speaking to you. And she said, oh, you must tell them to follow you on Twitter. And I said, oh, I never really do. I've never done that before, tell people to follow me on Twitter. I said, because I don't think of Twitter as being part of my work. It's kind of, you know, the other part of me, sort of the living part. And she said, yeah, but in your case, there isn't any difference. And first of all, I thought, well, that's rather demoralizing. But let's not look at it in a demoralizing way. Anyway, yeah, that's the end of that. But if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you're very welcome. I don't tweet very much about the Arctic, but in fact, I'm doing a bit of the Antarctic at the moment because it's the centenary of the best polar book ever written, which is absolutely Cherry Garrard's Worst Journey in the World. If you haven't read that, you have to go and read it immediately. And I'm Cherry's biographer, so I'm doing a series of quotes from The Worst Journey, which is nothing but a pleasure. So here we have, this sort of leaps in the middle of nowhere about Franklin, but it's when John Ray walks onto the stage. Of Franklin, however, there was no news until 1854, when Orkney man and company surveyor John Ray returned to London. Eskimo hunters, Ray reported, had encountered 40 starving members of Franklin's party dragging a boat near the north shore of King William Island, which almost touches the mainland. And later the same season, others found 35 white corpses near the same island's Great Fish River. I expect you know all of this already. The bodies had been partially eaten, and fragments of human flesh floated in the kettles. Nobody wanted to hear about that. Dickens, he was always to the fore with all of this polar news coming back. Dickens sorted it out with magisterial authority by concluding that the chaps were simply too decent to have set about one another with a knife and fork. We submit, he declaimed angrily in one of 2 pieces in Household Words, that the memory of the lost Arctic voyagers is placed by reason and experience high above the taint of this so easily allowed connection, and that the noble conduct and example of such men and of their own great leader himself, under similar endurances, belies it and outweighs by the weight of the whole universe the chatter of a gross handful of uncivilized people with a domesticity of blood and blubber. These latter, of course, were the Inuit, and Dickens' diatribe constituted propaganda of the Soviet variety. We believe every savage to be in his heart covetous, treacherous, and cruel, Dickens insisted. And of course, at bottom, he was right about that, because the Inuit are just like us. Thank you. Hope you'll ask me some questions.
That's a very good way to end. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. It was really interesting to see all the different points of view. And I certainly think that although it's a very kind of romantic kind of view of the Arctic and things, that we can't really escape from the fact that humans are kind of very damaging to it, and that there must be a huge thing to take into account. And I watch a lot of people sailing. I really like sailing, and there was people that had gone up to Svalbard, and they were saying that basically what humans do, it reaches all corners. You have this in your mind that it's the most pristine environment because it's not touched by anything, but so you find more kind of pollution and plastics up there than what you find anywhere else, because that's where it all ends up, isn't it? So it's interesting to you kind of forget about it because you think nobody's up there, it must be the perfect environment, but it's not the case, is it? It seems to take the brunt of everything that we do.
Yes, that's true.
Right, so if anybody's got any questions, if you want to pop them in the chat box, or if you can't find the chat box, which sometimes happens, feel free just to chip in and have any questions you might have. There's usually questions. I'll start off with a question while people are thinking. Do you think you'll ever go back to the Arctic?
It's difficult to imagine my future without going back, but I feel I'd have to have something to do or say. You know, it's quite an investment. I don't mean financially, but personally in some way. And I feel that I had something to say when I went to the Magnetic North, and but something will come up again. I hope so. I very much hope so. A couple of things have been offered, but I just have felt I got something else, something else now, something else, I'm very much a generalist on the basis that somebody has to be one. And I mean, it's all the same that I write about, just different places where the same themes come out. So I very much hope so, but I can't quite envisage at the moment what it'll be that takes me back to the Arctic or the Antarctic. On the day my, it's you know, it's a big thing going there. On the day my Arctic book was published, one of my kids said to me, "Oh, how do you feel today, Mum? You know, you've invested so much of your life in the polar region, spent so much time there, and even longer in your head. And you know, how do you feel?" And I said, "I thought about it. And I said, I feel tremendous relief. There's only 2 polar regions."
Right, we've got a question in the chat here from Simon Curtis that says, "Sarah, thank you for sharing your story. As we know, humans are narrative beings, and I would be interested if in your travels you encountered the stories of the Arctic peoples, and how are they being shared and recognized?"
You mean their own stories, Simon, that they've written or they've told one another, have been handed down the generations? Yeah. Well, there have been efforts to write things down, and certainly in the Russian language, stories have been taken down by ethnographers. It's quite a business, so that all the different languages, as I said, but and mostly they've only gone into Russian so far, but once they're captured in Russian. So, and there's a lot of Lap stories in English, a lot of Sami and Lap fairy tales and so on. I think the Canadians latterly have been, if you look around, you can find the stories, the oral histories that have now been put down onto paper or onto screens for fear that they won't be passed down as they have been passed down for millennia, really, in some cases. And they're really well worth seeking out. I recommend it.
Could I ask? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, only go.
Could I ask, is there a part of the world that you'd dearly like to go to that you've never managed to get to?
Loads, absolutely loads. Yeah, I haven't been anywhere.
Which
really.
in particular? Any particular one that you would love to go
to? Well, I just came back from the first time I managed to get away for a couple of years for obvious reasons. I just came back from Zanzibar, where I was 6 weeks on assignment. And I must say, I had some experience of Swahili culture before, in Kenya mainly, but I do find it incredibly agreeable. It's that sort of douceur de vivre of Swahili life, and it's great living outside all the time. And it's certainly in Zanzibar, the Arab influence and the history and that mix. And of course, they speak Swahili even on the Tanzanian mainland. And I went down to the top of Lake Nyasa. It wasn't planned part of the trip, but it was that time when all the planes were being cancelled, including mine, which I must say I was jolly pleased about. So I had more time, went over to the mainland there and went down to the south of Tanzania. There's still people still speaking Swahili. And gosh, that was just heavenly there on the tip of Lake Nyasa, and people just going about their business, and just like they have done for, you know, well, how long have they been there on Lake Nyasa catching their fish, going out in dugouts at dawn? How long do you think? 2,000 years? So I wrote a book a few years ago about a guy in East Africa. I was in East Africa and spent time there for that. And I haven't been back for a long time, and it gave me the taste, I must say. But part of my heart is in it was always been in South America since my second book was about Chile. And I spent 6 months in Chile, going from the Peruvian border to Cape Horn, and fell very deeply in love with the country, really. And I've always thought I would spend more time in other South American countries. I've been on assignment a few places, Brazil and Argentina, and some in Central America as well, but not very much. I've always thought there might be a book somewhere in, you know, Paraguay, probably too dangerous in Paraguay, but maybe Uruguay or Venezuela when it calms down a bit, Colombia. Yeah, I could go, it's that question you asked me, I could go on and on and on, just like I've just mentioned a few now. There's millions more. People think I've been everywhere, but I haven't. Well, I was with one of my kids once up in the Puna, very high Andes in Argentina on assignment. And the great thing about being with small children there is there's no electricity, so they can't carry on with all of this. They have to talk to you. And we'd been with somebody earlier that day, been showing off about, in a very agreeable, nice light over how many countries he'd been to. So my son said, "How many countries have you been to, Mum?" I thought, oh, here's an opportunity to waste half an hour. So I said, "I've got no idea how many. Let's write them down. You write them down. So let's divide them into continents." Anyway, we went through all that. And once you've had a few arguments about how many countries there are in the world, which, as you know, is not at all straightforward, the long and the short of it is I've been to half the countries in the world.
And we all know that Orkney's at the top of your list for your next visit, because you've never been to Orkney.
No, I was telling James before you arrived, I would love to go to Orkney. I've been to Shetland and I've been to Skye. Absolutely loved both hugely. Yes, I should have said that, of course. That's my main, on the top of my list, my main. I will go. I had the best time in both of those places, Shetland and Skye, and I know that Orkney is much, much nicer.
Of course, it is the best. It is the best one. We're not biased at all. So we've got a hand up, and then we've got another question in the chat, but we'll go for the hand first.
Okay. You talked a lot about the people surrounding the polar region, the North Polar region, and at some points you said how separate they were, that they spoke different languages and couldn't speak to each other. On the other hand, you were drawing out the great similarities as well between these people. And I wondered if you saw any mileage in them linking together politically. To some extent, I think something has happened. Do you think that would be a good thing? Is it possible? Is it going to happen?
It has to be a good thing, doesn't it? Because it's strength. And you're right, there is, I mentioned it, there are circumpolar people's groups. I think that largely they're organized in through the Canadian network, very inclusive, very zeitgeist, everybody. Of course, it's difficult because those things need money, because you've got to transport people around, you've got to get them, even a lot of them aren't connected. There's a long way to go. The EU was a great beneficiary it was a great doler out of money for those kind of things, but then you have to be able to fill in the grant application, EU, which takes about 50 PhDs, and 9 years to do, and so help these people equipped to do that. Anyway, strengthen. The truth is, the only real hope is the hydrocarbon. Is the big chip they've got. That's what they've got to offer, particularly with things like, the rules about coastal shelves, how far the land goes out underneath the water proves whether you own it or not, and that means you can drill and so on. And the polar peoples are the ones, obviously, that first of all know about all of that, and secondly have some sort of ownership. So the zeitgeist, the cultural climate is with them from that point of view. So we must have hope. It's very expensive to get people together when the powerful, the great and the good don't really want you to get together to have one voice, but it does exist. And if you start Googling around to find circumpolar people's conferences and this and that, you will find stuff there, and we wish them well.
The question in the chat, I really like this question. It's do your children have any particular memories of going on your journeys?
Yeah, loads. Yeah, they do. So you remember the little baby in the sledge? Well, he's 6'5", and he doesn't remember being in the sledge, but he does remember a ton of stuff. And yeah, they do. They have lots of memories, and they have become great travelers. I mean, you'd think, wouldn't you, that it might? They didn't really have anything to rebel against from that point of view. And they do have memories. They do. And we talk about it, and yeah, they have stuff, and they remember, and they go off on their own. They do go off on their own traveling, to my complete horror, of course. I mean, I don't mind them doing it. I just don't want them to do it like I did it. It's too dangerous. But yeah, they're great travelers. And there are many memories. Yeah, turns, taking it in turns, you know, and then their dad had to have his turn, and yeah. And still now I can, you know, try and play my hand. You know, obviously they don't want to go away with the old biddy like me anymore, but I can get myself to places which I know, you know, when I say, will you come to Zanzibar for Christmas, I'll pay your airfare. So it works. I get the benefit as well. So they did all come out when I can. Yeah, and they sort of somehow get over the hideousness of being with a 60-year-old old bat, to do more of what it is that they love. Yeah. Only one of them's got a hookworm from Zanzibar, but anyway, there's a downside to it.
I think it's such a good thing for them to be able to experience the world from a young age, isn't it? 'Cause there's so many kids that miss out on that, like because of technology and things. They get wrapped up in their screens and things like that. But even just going out for walks in your local area and things makes such a difference to kind of just broadening your mind a bit, doesn't it? But
oh yeah, absolutely. And going out and walking in your local area where you live must be paradise on earth in terms of connecting with the world.
yeah, exactly. And there's so many kids miss out on that, and it's got so many benefits. It makes such a difference to their mental well-being. So we've got another question in the chat here from Laura that says, do you have a favorite Arctic place?
Oh dear. Yeah, people often ask me about what my favorite country is. It's a question I often get asked, and I usually reply rather facetiously, well, no, it's like boyfriends, you love the one you're with until you don't anymore. And I can't really answer that because, you know, I've got such amazing memories of you know, on that whole road in Alaska, and this great trucker I was with, you know, she was such a great woman, a sort of dauntless against all the odds, driving this thing that to me was the size of 5 houses, driving it, you know, up the whole road. And yeah, the barren, you know, the Canadian Arctic with this sort of enormous, great herds of reindeer, so beautiful, and top of the Greenland ice sheet, which is a lot like the Antarctic, sort of biological haiku, and just energy coming off white. You can't, there's no topographical landmarks at all, just white. And you know, Russia, Siberia, you know, lives very large, doesn't it, in the imagination, but the great writers of, you know, many of my great writers in my pantheon wrote about Siberia, Dostoevsky and Chekhov and so on. And so Russian Siberia's very much, yeah, on my mind when I think of the places I've loved in the polar regions. But just, you know, lots to love about a lot of places, despite what the gloom I might portray sometimes.
That's perfect. I think that's all the questions anyway, so I think that'll be a good place to wrap up. Thank you so much again. It's an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and very inspiring. And it just makes me want to go off and go and see other things. And I think we might have to wait a little while long before we can start getting about like we used to be able to. But no, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And next time when I come and talk about a book, I hope I'll be able to come up and speak about it in Orkney.
Yes, definitely. And are people still able to buy your book, the Magnetic North one? That's
yeah. Magnetic North. Yeah, it's still available in yeah, I think you'll get that easily enough from your local independent bookseller. You must have a good bookshop there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. People will need to go and read more of that too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me, and look forward to seeing you again.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Good night, everybody.
Right. Good night.
Good night.